This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we will discuss Chapter 13, Sports and Politics. How do governments and global political processes influence sports? Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Good morning, Jeff. So good to be with you today.
Yep, it's always great. Let's jump right into it. And we were talking in the last episode, Jay. When we said we would kick it over to this episode too, because there's so much connection. But we were talking about Black NFL players' protests against police violence in Black communities, and that it was difficult for a lot of white sports writers to understand the protests. And we could add a lot of white fans and league executives also struggled to understand those protests. One of the reasons that we gave for white folks not understanding the protests is because, or I should say many white folks, because many did identify with it, it's because white people, they just don't experience, at least in the United States, the racism and state violence that Black and other racialized minorities do. And as a result, a lot struggle to understand those protests since what was being protested was outside of their experiences. But if we think about the shut up and dribble statement, we can see that there's more to it than just that. And I was hoping that something you could get us started by elaborating on.
Yeah, I think that throughout history, basically, attending a sport event has always been a collective experience that creates emotional unity. And political issues and other things as well can disrupt that emotional unity. And, anybody who's been to games and experienced that emotional unity, it's a pleasurable experience. And it gives you this sense of connectedness. I think it's a false sense in many cases because, you won't cross paths with 98% of the people that are in the crowd anyway, unless it's a high school game or a local game in some way. And then the collective experience and the emotional unity that's created can carry over into other situations. And for anyone to disrupt that emotional unity, it becomes disruptive and it becomes disappointing in a way. And you'd really have to be aligned real strongly with the disruption, not to be disappointed that your emotional unity has been destroyed. So that's kind of the social psychology of it. And but once sports started to become commercialized and ticket sales were important and the fan experience became not just important, but it became a managed thing. And once that happened, the people who were benefiting from commercial sports didn't want conflicting political ideas, ideologies, and motives interfering with that emotional unity and distracting people from the competition and the teamwork and the athletes with whom people identified with on the floor. So they saw it as being just out of bounds. And So they believed that sport should be automatically a neutral and entertaining space. And most of them disagreed with the progressive ideas that might have been expressed by athletes in their opinions. And they felt that those athletes were going beyond the boundaries of what was permissible from their perspective. So, and to make their point, they accused the athletes of being disrespectful, disruptive, and even unpatriotic. And that ties into some other issues that we're going to get to about how politics have been subtly woven into certain kinds of sport events to the point where we just take them for granted now.
Yeah, and we will definitely come back to the taken for granted politics that are woven into the events. Kenneth Sean Chaplin and we did this article a few years ago, and the research for it was Sean had interviewed students at the college where he teaches and asked them about, what did they think of the protests, and the students were really split, as you would imagine. We're just like they were split everywhere else. Like there was kind of a liberal and a conservative position. And consistently amongst the conservative students who were opposed to the protests, one of the things they said I found really interesting going through those transcripts. It was really clear, and this ties back to our earlier discussion about commercialism in sport and how we talked about how commercialism leads sport to be spectacles, these commercial spectacles. And the students were really angry because for them, like a lot of other people, sport on television, these commercial spectacles are an escape from their everyday lives.
Right.
And this is like not unusual, right? There's a huge literature on this that in a capitalist society where we have alienating jobs, most people hate their jobs. We might be proud of the work we do. We might be proud of being workers, but most people really don't love their jobs. And so the alienating conditions on the shop floor, whether it's an office space or a factory or whatever, right? People look for an escape from that. And there's lots of different escapes. For some people, it's having a drink after work, right? For a lot of people, it's popular culture, media, and sport, of course, is one part of media and popular culture. And so they took on what we called a consumerist attitude, where they're paying, if they're watching, if they're in the stadium, they're paying with the ticket. But if you're watching it on television, which most of us do, watch most of our sports on television, you're paying by sitting through commercials, right? Or you're paying for ESPN or some other service. And so they feel like we're paying for this escape, and we're trying to escape the issues that these players are bringing up, but that's not their job. Their job is to entertain us and make us happy. And it's a profoundly depoliticizing attitude, and it separates fans from the lives and the experiences of the athletes that they love. And so then it's like, well, what kind of love is that, right? You love them as long as they'll entertain you in the way that you want. It's a very, it's a very complicated thing, but it all gets back to what you were talking about, Jay, which is this attitude that politics have no place in sports, right? That there should be this separation. And obviously sports are filled with politics, and we'll come back to that. But can you just talk a little bit more about this idea that politics have no place in sports?
Well, one of the other issues, especially in terms of commercial sports, is that the people who control them and own them come from conservative backgrounds. And depending on the sport, many of the athletes don't. They come from backgrounds where they've been exposed to progressive ideas, And they know the troubles that they've experienced, maybe in their neighborhoods, especially when we're talking about the NBA and the NFL and some of the other sports within which Black athletes constitute a significant minority or even a majority of the athletes. So there's that background split, and politically, many of the athletes who are playing in those professional sports have had to go to college to get there. And they've been exposed to a wide range of ideas, many of which are progressive. So, they are coming to professional sports with a perspective and an orientation that differs from the people who control their lives. So, and they know that, by the way, and they're careful in terms of when and how they express themselves on political issues. But there are times, like the George Floyd police killing and the Black Lives Matter responses to it, and the athletes joining in one by one, with Kaepernick being the first, but others following along, expressing their displeasure with police violence and expressing their displeasure with the way race has been defined and lived within American culture. So that issue was crucial. Now, predating that issue, by the way, there have been some gender issues that were much more subtle, and the women who were taking more progressive activist roles were so out of sight in many cases that they didn't become national issues. And now that's starting to change, by the way, and we've seen it with Caitlin Clark and with the WNBA and with what's going on there and what's going on internationally with some of the women's sports, especially soccer on a national level. So
I think it's important to recognize that, Colin Kaepernick got a lot of attention, rightfully so. But it was Black women basketball players that led the protests. They initiated the protests before Colin Kaepernick.
That's right.
Which is, again, it's that gender dynamic that it's very easy to overlook women, and especially Black women, in favor of a Black man who fulfills our expectation of what an activist athlete looks like. And one of the other things I was just to add in here is when the athletes who protested were asked, why did you do this? Consistently, they said either they personally or somebody who was close to them had been harassed by the police. Mm-hmm. Because that's the reality in Black and other communities of color, is that people get harassed by the police. Now, if you live in an affluent white community, it's far less likely for a person to be harassed by the police, especially if they haven't done anything illegal, broken laws,
right.
Being something of that nature. And so the research is really clear. In white communities, white people see the police as not just allies, but protectors. Where in Black and other racialized communities, the police are oftentimes seen as a threat. And that's why we have such a disjuncture when it came to this particular issue across different racial communities.
Yeah, let me give you a locker room example of that. When the individual demonstrations and sometimes group demonstrations by the athletes occurred, especially in professional and a few college teams. One of the things that happened was that coaches came into the locker room and asked the Black athletes, why are you so upset? And the white athletes who had been playing with Black athletes for much of their lives asked the same question. And this is really interesting. The conversations had never occurred. That information it's not shared immediately. And unless the media cover it, and unless it's covered in a way that forces people to face up to it and to have conversations about it, the communication doesn't occur. And the coaches were really surprised, and many of the teammates were surprised at the experiences that their athletes and their teammates had just recently as they've lived their lives in their neighborhoods and as they've gone out in the evenings and so on. So that's a classic example of how many whites just didn't understand because they never had access to the information.
Right. If you don't personally experience it, you live in a segregated society where you don't have close friendships. I mean, it's kind of shocking that the athletes hadn't heard those stories, but it just, again, it really emphasizes subtle ways that become very obvious about how race works.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of my personal experience, when I started playing basketball in college in 1962 and 1963, 62 through 66, when we traveled through the Southwest and into California and into the Northwest, our coach had to be aware of what restaurants we could eat at because this was a racially integrated team, which was one of the things that attracted me from Chicago to go to this school. So we would check out restaurants, we would check out hotels, and make sure that Blacks were allowed to stay or to eat. And by the way, we were thrown out of places because of the Black teammates. So, that experience for me opened my eyes, but my ears opened more slowly because the Black athletes were hesitant to talk about it and tie it in with the rest of their lives. And it took years before I started communicating with them at that level.
Well, not everyone wants to talk about these issues all the time.
That's right.
And not everyone wants to take on the obligation of educating every white person around them. It gets really exhausting really fast. But I want to move us on because this is really interesting. And we could spend the whole podcast just discussing this. But a lot of people have said, and this was one of the major responses to this protest, that, politics have no place in sports, right? That's that shut up and dribble, which also takes, the shut up and dribble also takes on larger racial connotations as well. This is kind of amazing, Jay. Think about this. We're talking about a protest during the national anthem, and the response was, there's no space for politics in sports. It's the national anthem. It's the definition of politics, right? I mean, we get the color guard walking out onto the field. We might have flyovers. We've got presidents throwing the first pitch, right, at baseball games. The list of very obvious political acts that happen in sporting events is extremely long. I didn't even mention the flags. So why is it that people, Jay, why are people criticizing protests by saying sports and politics don't mix when we have so many obvious examples of sports in every single political space? I mean, in every single sporting space.
Yeah. Well, the short answer is it's been around for so long, ever since sports became organized and people paid attention to it on a national and an international level, that we just take it for granted. I mean, we don't even see it as political, even though the original motivations to include those things were explicitly political. And, when I'll go back to colonization. And when Great Britain colonize close to half of the world, they took their sports with them. And they took their sports with them to change the people they were colonizing. They wanted them to be introduced to a new set of cultural values, a new cultural perspective, the whole notion of hierarchies of authority, the whole notion of obedience, the whole notion of uh, competition as being a way to distribute rewards, and productivity and loyalty and teamwork. So all of those things the British were communicating through bringing cricket and their football, soccer, to the rest of the world. And when Baron de Coubertin started the Olympics, the reason he started it was because he looked around, saw the French population being sedentary. They weren't militarily prepared. He knew that they would lose if they just faced off with the British. So, participating in any kind of conflict where they would expect to win was just off the table. So his motivation for founding the modern Olympics was to get the French men, especially, off their asses and become physically active and be ready to be militarily trained and prepared. So that was his motivation. And the motivation for organized sports in schools was to assimilate, and organized sports in the playground movement in the United States was to assimilate immigrant kids to American values. They were the goal was explicitly political. So this is the history. So when you see the flag and you hear the anthem, and in some cases, when I was growing up, the Pledge of Allegiance, if you looked at history, you knew where those things came from. They were political. They were meant to be political. They served a political purpose. And now they're just taken for granted, but they're still serving a political purpose.
Such a good example of what you're talking about is the national anthem itself. At this point, people think it's just normal and natural that before every sporting event at every level, every organized sporting event at every level, you play the national anthem first, people stand up, they put their hand on their heart, so on and so forth. We haven't always played the national anthem before sporting events. It's a relatively modern thing. I mean, it happened, but it didn't happen systematically. During the Cold War, a decision was made to start playing the national anthem before every single sporting event. And its goal was explicitly political, which was to motivate citizens to support the Cold War effort, which, as you know, Jay, was extremely expensive and required a lot of engagement in foreign politics when the United States historically had been isolationist. And so there were all these things going on in the Cold War to get citizens to accept a very activist foreign policy agenda. And the sporting space with the national anthem, that was just one of them. And we're really talking like, what is it now, 60, 70 years that the national anthem has been a picture of sporting events?
Yeah, 70 years, 75 years coming on here. And and that was so explicit at that particular time. And, another way of putting what you just said is they wanted to reaffirm national identity. And how do you reaffirm national identity with a lot of people at once at a sport event? I mean, there's not too many other events where you could do that and get that much participation. So that was part of the logic that was used for that change. And by the way, it carried on in a very explicit way through the entire Cold War, and then just became woven into the fabric of certain sport events to the point where people just kept it after 1991 and just took it for granted. Now, that didn't happen, by the way, in a lot of other countries where they didn't play the national anthem. And, the United States and their allies, the word was we should all be fostering a national identity and tying it to global relations. So that was a crucial issue at the time, a defense issue in many ways.
Now, we're going to talk about some other ways in which sport is profoundly political a little bit later in the podcast, or the episode, I should say. But I also want to talk about, because we bring this up in the chapter, how protests can be interpreted differently. And we lay out a little section. We talk about the Chester 8 in 1968, just very briefly. Chester, Pennsylvania, there was a football game, a high school football game in 1968. Some Black students, I think, sat during the national anthem, and that led to a race riot during the halftime. And so Black kids and white kids were fighting there, and the Black kids were arrested, and they were, several of them were sent to jail for years over this. And you read about it in the chapter. Also, so the reaction to those kids was draconian, actual prison time for protesting during the national anthem. In 1973, African-American cheerleaders at Brown University, they also sat during the national anthem before basketball games in Providence. And the reaction was very similar to what we saw, recently with the NFL players. And, so there was pushback, but there was also some support from the Brown administration.
Mm-hmm.
A group of veterans in 1974 at Harper's College, they had, they had wanted to protest during the national anthem. Gerald Ford, who was the president at that time, briefly after Nixon, had, I think, I forget exactly what it was. It's in the chapter, but it was something like he discontinued a veterans benefit, or he wouldn't offer a benefit for veterans. So they wanted to protest that during the anthem. And so the school didn't play the anthem. So what the veterans did is they went and they took the flag at night, they took it down, and they raised it upside down at half mast. And that was initially a firestorm, but then quickly people realized it was veterans that had, and this is during the Vietnam War, they were all Vietnam vets, had engaged in this protest. A much more serious protest than the other two, where the flag was actually handled and mispurposed, right? Upside down and half-mast. But the administration supported them, and there was no repercussion.
Yeah.
So very, very different. And I should say that the kids in Chester, Pennsylvania, Chester has had a very long history of racial tensions, and it was in a period of economic decline in 1968 when that happened. So I want to get you to respond to this, Jay, as a sociologist. Can you talk about some of the ways in which class, race, social history, veteran status, so forth, right, etc. How might these different things impact the way in which other people interpret a protest?
Yeah, and let me just go back one quick second and talk about Smith and Carlos and the 1968 Olympics and Mexico City, and raising their clenched fists while they were on the podium during the anthem, and how they were escorted immediately out of Mexico City. And they received nothing but negative attention. There was no, it took years and years before anything positive came their way in connection with that demonstration. So that just illustrates your point on a global level. And yeah, when a protest occurs, if it occurs in a context where the athletes are personally known, where their backgrounds are known, many people who are observing are going to understand. But like we mentioned earlier, if people don't have an idea of what's motivated the protest on a personal level, then they're going to object because their emotional unity and the pleasure they experience associated with it has been disrupted. So if there is an opportunity for those athletes to express themselves, to get known personally, to let people know why they did it, they can not only diffuse some of the objections, but possibly gain understanding and even support. So that's one of the things that's been missing in a lot of these cases, where the athletes are not the athletes or the cheerleaders in Brown's case. They've been pretty much silenced, or if they're talking, nobody's covering it. And so the people who are objecting to what they've done never have a chance to understand the motives that underlie it, which they might not agree with, but at least they'd understand it. And if they did agree with it, they might provide support. And I think we could probably think of some examples of where that's been the case, so that as long as the athletes have an opportunity to express their voice on their terms and have people hear it, then that can start discussions. And that's what the athletes are after anyway. And because those discussions are going to raise policy issues. So that's the process. But I think that the protests have to be planned in ways that they're tied to that. Can you find a journalist who will give you an opportunity? Jerry Brewer at the San Francisco Chronicle. If I was in San Francisco and I was Kaepernick, I would have gotten him right there. And because he would have given me an opportunity to express myself on my terms. And he would have printed it the way I said it. So there's a process going on here. It's not just a one-off protest. The goal of that protest is to eventually evoke change. But the people who are protesting have to realize that and start thinking about what's going to happen after the protest.
So I apologize, Jay, but I'm going to be pedantic for just a moment here on our podcast episode, and just underline, I think, the sociological point that you're getting at here, which is, it always drives me crazy whenever I hear somebody say, "Oh, that's just me. This is just my opinion." Like, we exist in a vacuum, and our opinions are just our own unique opinions. But one of the things that you're highlighting, and that, we highlight, like talking about the Chester 8, right? It's a city with a history of racial strife, and it's experiencing an economic downturn because of deindustrialization that was going on globally and nationally and globally. People are already angered. The protest just is the little spark that sets off the fire. But what they're really fighting about wasn't even the protest, but that those outside forces impacts how people interpret their own lived biographies, the context in which they live in, what the symbols mean to people. And the same symbol can mean similar but very different things, right? So it's never just this, you as the individuals, like having your own unique interpretation. Your interpretation is always patterned and contoured by your family, your community, the larger world that you're living in. And again, that's why people have different experiences. And so people have different interpretations of the very thing. Looking at the protester, do you identify with that protester? Do you hold that protester? Do you revere that person that's engaging in the protest? We can all see protests that we like, and we can all see protests that we don't like. And that's one of the things that we're debating, at least in the United States and many other places. We're debating the meanings of different protests, not just the sporting ones. But, one of the things I find fascinating is how sports, especially after the racial reckoning of 2020, began drawing on the language of protest in their marketing messages, right? And we see that really clearly in the NFL. We see that really clearly in the NBA, the WNBA. This oftentimes gets called socially conscious marketing. It also gets called commodity activism. There's a number of different names for this, but it's because marketers are advertising their values and politics in their sales pitches, and it's been around for a long time, but it hasn't been common until 5, maybe 10 years ago. Nike really pushed this, going back a little ways, but not just Nike. We see other corporations doing this. Chick-fil-A, right? Chick-fil-A is like the yin to Nike's liberal yang. Both of those companies will market in ways that will anger people, and that's kind of risky in marketing and advertising, right? But that by angering one group of people, the group that you're actually trying to reach gets excited and says, that corporation holds my values, and therefore I want to express my values by consuming their commodities. And so there's this whole debate about socially conscious marketing, and I thought you would, it'd be great to have you talk about that, right? One argument about socially conscious marketing is that it amplifies activist messages. It helps activists who are working at the grassroots level, right? Another argument, and there's more than two, but another argument is corporations are co-opting activist labor, and they're co-opting the messages of activists, and they're doing it for corporate profit, and it depoliticizes the politics of the activism. Yeah, and I'd just like to have you comment on this type of marketing and the debate about it.
Yeah. The whole term socially conscious marketing raises some conflicting ideas when I think about it. It's helpful to an extent, but the end goal is corporate profits. Now, I've worked with people at Nike on certain kinds of social issues related to youth sports and related to women in sports, and I know that the people who are running these campaigns have their hearts in the right place. They have their heads almost 100% in the right place. But the problem is that if they go too far, if the conflicts become too negative in terms of impact on corporate profits, they're not the people in control. So they know that, so they have to be careful. So if the world turns out to be a better place after the socially conscious marketing, that's a great bonus. But to do it again, you've got to make the case to the corporation that it's not going to hurt the bottom line. And I think probably predating the socially conscious marketing example that you gave was Nike's support of women's sports. But it was so closely tied to Nike apparel and Nike shoes and Nike sponsored events that were definitely marketing in nature, that Nike was encouraged by that. Sales were boosted. Women were buying their products all over the place. This was tied to the women's movement and women's empowerment. And I think it probably motivated women. Well, I know it motivated women to express themselves in other contexts. But Nike benefited. And that gave them, I think, the courage to try it again. So And that's one of the things that hangs me up on the socially conscious marketing. If it works in terms of the bottom line, then we're all for it. If it doesn't work, then we better get back to just marketing things the way we know are effective. So, and that's an issue for the people who are involved in that. Anybody who's working for those corporations and participates in a corporate responsibility effort or a socially conscious marketing effort, they have to know that that's an issue.
That's right. And it's a tricky discussion.
Yeah.
I've actually written about it a lot. I have very strong ideas, so I won't go down that road too far. But so I actually want to switch gears a little bit and focus on something that's similar, different, but similar. And that's this idea of sport washing, right? And this is the idea that nations will invest in high-profile sporting events because the positive emotions associated with sports that sports create can obscure human rights abuses that nations engage in. Saudi Arabia is the poster child right now for that. They invest in so many high-profile sporting, golf, soccer, boxing, so on and so forth. And of course, they have a terrible human rights record. Starting with all we have to do is talk about the assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who criticized the government, and they this little graphic, they cut a man up alive into pieces while he was still alive. So that's pretty brutal. But one of the things that I was hoping you could do, Jay, is this is the sport washing. It doesn't come from nowhere. Maybe you can historicize sport washing for us a bit.
Well, once a negative image about a country or even a particular organization becomes public and publicized, we'll stick with nations right here now. They want to change the narrative, and they've done enough observing of international events to know that when a globally popular sport event occurs, that narrative takes over the world. And so one of the best ways to change the negative narrative is to host the Olympics, a FIFA World Cup, the international track and field competitions, and international swimming, any of those, and change the narrative in connection with that. So Saudi Arabia is doing that right now. They're hosting boxing events. They've hosted soccer events. They've paid literally billions of dollars to high-profile soccer stars to come and play in their league so that they get attention on something other than Khashoggi and all of the other human rights violations that they've engaged in the recent past. Qatar did the same thing with the World Cup. So they had labor issues, exploitation. They had exploitation of immigrants. The immigrants who were laborers were basically captive in the country. Up to 20,000 of them died because of the oppressive working conditions. And Qatar had to change the narrative. So they made sure that World Cup was presented in a way that took over the global media. And now one of the issues that I have here is that the data are kind of thin. It's really tough to study this. And was Qatar effective? Was the Soviet Union effective when they boycotted the games in Los Angeles in 1984? Were they effective in 1980 when they hosted the games?
The United States boycotted.
Oh, the United States
boycotted the 1980 games,
right?
And the Soviet Union responded in 84 by about
That's right.
boycotting the Los Angeles games. Yeah, absolutely.
Excuse me. Yeah, I got confused on that one. But yeah, so that was part of trying to get a hold of the narrative and get it favoring you. So we're gonna see that possibly in the future with some of the conflicts that are going on now. Our country's going to try to redeem themselves through sports, and that's what we mean by sports washing. It's a redemption process, and it's a redemption process that takes advantage of the popularity of sport and the power of sport to change narratives.
And there's nothing new about it. Henry
Right.
Luce, who was the founder not just of Time and Life magazine and I think Money magazine, he also founded Sports Illustrated. So he had a profound interest in sports. I mean, Sports Illustrated was the first national all sports publication. In a very famous essay called The American Century, one of the things that he expounded on is the importance of soft power, that the way in which the United States was going to become a global leader following the Second World War was not just because of its military power and its economic power, but the cultural power. Hollywood musicians, popular singers, jazz musicians, and athletes are incredibly popular. And he said they're the best ambassadors of spreading the American way globally. And this is how we're going to win the Cold War. And this is how we're going to take leadership. And this will be the American century. And so when the United States did it and does it, we call it soft power. When Saudi Arabia does it, we call it sports washing. So we're a little inconsistent here, right? That
Yeah.
there's a double standard. And a friend of mine, he likes to say, if Saudi Arabia engages in sports washing, so does the United States.
Yeah, and I think for the Olympics coming up, there probably will be a commentator talking about how many of the Olympians from other countries actually trained in the United States on college scholarships at American universities. And that's part of that. One of the reasons that the US has been open to that is it is a good strategy to expand soft power.
So one of the things we've really focused a lot so far, Jay, in this episode on protests, right? As one way in which sports and politics fuse. But there are a lot of other ways in which sports and politics fuse. And arguably, I would say the other ways are probably more important to our everyday lives than protest. I mean, I'm not saying protest isn't important because obviously you and I study protests and protests in sports, but there's other things. And so maybe you could talk about some of the different ways in which governments at local, regional, and national levels drive and shape sports.
Yeah, I think that there have been some changes over the past decades, but communities on a local level have always sponsored sport spaces, sport leagues, sport teams, and the big question is what venues and what spaces are publicly provided? Where are they? Who do they serve? And who benefits generally from them? Which sports and for whom? And so those political issues get built right into the baseball diamonds that were built in the 1950s. And then as football became more popular, the football fields that were built in the 1980s and 90s. And so then, and what are the rules for access to those spaces and venues? Who has priority access? How is money involved? How is organization and political influence involved? So there's this underlying political process that is tied to the sponsorship of sports spaces and venues and sports programs. even on a local level, or in many cases, especially on the local level, on a regional level, what venues are available, for example, for professional and other elite regional sports, and why those venues? Why not something else? I remember when I was first looking in detail on issues related to gender, I came across, and I can't remember where I came across this, where major stadiums were called men's cultural centers. And, that was part of this subtle political process. The venues were being built for men. And women were an afterthought, even though they were voters. So, the political implications of what gets built where and for whom and who can use it under what conditions, all those things are tied to, in some cases, political ideology at the get-go, but then political processes that occur in connection with those venues and spaces.
And I think one of the reasons why this doesn't get seen as sports and politics is because we have a very narrow conception of sports generally, that it is elite sports and that it's competitive and it's all of these things, even though we're all engaging, maybe not all of us, but so many of us are engaging in other kinds of sports, non-elite sports that aren't about competition. So for instance, I get up in the morning, I'm going to ride I ride my bicycle to work campus. I ride along a city path, because I'm away from cars that way. And that was the building bicycle paths is an investment in public health. So it's a discussion of public health. It's not a discussion of sport, even though cycling is sport, right? It's a discussion of public health. I ride my bicycle past a city swimming pool. I ride my bicycle past city pickleball courts. I ride my bicycle past a municipal park that has open spaces that can be used for soccer. It can be used for ultimate. It can be used for other kinds of sporting activities. There's a baseball diamond. There's the landscape. And so this also gets discussed, not just in public health, in terms of public health, but urban planning. And so there are all of these decisions that the government is making about the construction of sporting spaces, which allows us as citizens to inhabit those spaces and use those spaces in, a variety of different ways. But we don't always call it sport. But this is as you said, this is a political process, and it profoundly impacts the sports system, whether it's in the sense of producing athletes who can go out and be highly competitive, or it's older people like myself or yourself, Jay, who just want to stay active and live a healthy life. And riding my bicycle is a lot less stressful than driving on the interstate to get to campus.
For sure. Especially if you're on a nicely tuned bike path. Sure.
Right. And that's another issue is the conditions. So the path that I ride on where I'm going, it is in good shape. So it's very smooth. It's very easy for me to ride on. When I want to head south to the south side of town, that Colorado Springs very well, the south side is historically the lower income area of Colorado Springs. The path disappears. It becomes very difficult to follow. The number of bicycle paths on the south side are far fewer, which means if children want to get out and ride their bicycles, they're riding on streets. And so as a parent, do you want your child riding on a very straight, very, street that has very traffic that's going really fast? Children in poor neighborhoods get hit by cars at a much higher rate. So again, the sport is not separate from all of these other considerations, as we've been talking about across these different episodes. Something else I was hoping you could address before we run out of time here, Jay, is talk specifically about how political leaders will use sports to legitimate their leadership.
Yeah, I mean, we see that in classic terms in the United States, where presidents invite championship teams to the White House and they do their photo ops and they sit down and have a meal and the press covers it. And it gives the president another identity that ties it to the nation state, ties it to achievement, ties it to championship athletes, ties it to popular sports, and possibly recruit some support, electoral support in the process. So leaders around the world have done this. The United States is not unique when it comes to this. They've aligned themselves with highly visible sports and highly visible athletes to highlight national success, to highlight national identity, and to be personally connected with those things. And right now, if you're paying attention in the newspapers, this is happening in France, where an election is coming up, and Emmanuel Macron, the centrist the president, has called for this election. He's going to be running against a long-term right-wing candidate, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and he recruited a soccer player, subtly recruited, Mbappe, who is the best soccer player in France, to make some public statements about how divisiveness is not the way to go, how we've got to get on the same page, we've got to move towards the center. We don't want some kind of a political leader that's going to create to intensify the divisiveness that's creating many problems, including problems related to race, by the way, and immigration. So he's supporting this athlete who's making those statements. Now, Mbappe is catching grief for being political, and this is an issue. I think Mbappe is going to withstand it in the long run, but these things happen from country to country.
You know, something similar that I found really interesting is the origin of the fascist-style political rally. We think about those fascist rallies, you know, starts in Italy. The fascism first occurs in Italy under Mussolini, and then the Third Reich in Germany, not modeled very much on the fascism of Italy. So that like really big spectacle of a rally that begins in Italy because Mussolini's head of propaganda went to a soccer match. Well, it would have been a football match in Italy. And he was so moved by the sporting spectacle and said, we need to adopt this to a political rally, because if you want to motivate people, and this also connects to socially conscious marketing, by the way, if you want to motivate people, you motivate them by mobilizing their emotions. And once you've got control over people's emotions, you have control over those people. And so the fascist style rally is modeled on a sports spectacle. Well, the fascist style political rally is the norm of the political rally now. You look at any national convention, whether it's the Democratic or Republican National Convention, they're very much like a fascist rally because it works. So there's another way in which sport and politics are deeply intertwined, right? It's not so direct. It's not, political rallies aren't sporting events, but they're modeled on sporting events.
Yeah.
That's just incredible.
Yeah. And that's easy for anybody to see. If you wanted to get people all moving in the same direction, a stadium with all home fans would be the place to start. And so they're in a sense malleable to messages when they're all together experiencing this emotional unity.
So we're just about, Jay, at our hour mark, so we probably should be wrapping up here, but I want to squeeze in one more question. And I hope you could address this quickly, and then I promise not to comment, because that's what always makes things take a long time. But maybe you could talk about some of the ways that international sports competitions advance the interests of powerful nation states over smaller nations and indigenous peoples.
Yeah, we cover this a little bit in the chapter, uh, but the global international events always favor the larger, wealthier nations. And, this became so clear to me when I started looking at the data and seeing that the United States has won more Olympic medals through history than any other countries. But when you control for population size, we rank 39th. And if you were controlling for gross national product or some other national economic indicator, we would fall below number 40 for sure. So the international events are driven by larger countries who are using them to gain a leg up in international relations, in just being known by people around the world as a significant actor in international relations on the basis of the medals that they win in the Olympics. The next two Olympics, we're going to see China really pushing the envelope on that. And maybe in some of the classes that people are in, they can start controlling for population size and use an economic indicator for another control and see really where China ends up or where the United States or Russia ends up. So you find out that the real performers might be somebody like Finland. So in terms of really producing per capita an abundance of elite athletes and medal winners.
It's really crazy when you look at like which are the nations who have the per capita the most athletes, and then thinking about what they're doing. And it's really something. Well, I promised I wouldn't comment, so I'm gonna start there so we can end on time. Well, thanks so much, Jay. In our next episode, we're going to discuss chapter 14, sports in high school and college. Do competitive sports contribute to education? And with that, I think we can sign out for today.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. There's all sorts of changes going on, so this will be an exciting one. Take care, Jeff.